Have you ever had that friend who's a super talented artist and absolutely impossible to buy for when it comes to their birthday? Because that is exactly how I ended up making this sketchbook watercolor travel set. This gift is made up of a hand-bound leather sketchbook, including pages of paper that I made and water marbled myself, paired with a watercolor tin that I found locally. I could not have done this project without a ton of great creators and resources here on YouTube. I tried to include as many as I could in the video, but do check the description down below to see some further links. Even if this is not something you're generally into, I hope you enjoy watching a part of my process. So my skin is shit because I can't give up dairy, and I'm kind of terrified of starting this project. Even though I have watched papermaking tutorials on YouTube before, this is the first step where things could potentially start going wrong, and this all just becomes a gigantic waste of time. That being said, I did start by ripping up some paper and blending it with some water. I kind of just blended it until it was fully incorporated. I then moved that pulp over to a strainer to try and strain off some extra water before moving it to a larger bucket that contained a bleach mixture. And I just repeated that process a lot. I did make sure to wash off any extra bleach from the pulp mixture before ending up with this huge bucket. Now, I do have some concerns. My mold and decal don't fit freely into my tub. It's kind of a tight fit. It is recommended that you use some sort of cooking spray so the paper doesn't stick to your decal. I unfortunately don't own any cooking spray. My pulp mixture is gray. I did try bleaching the mixture, but it didn't seem to be doing much of anything, and I kind of sensed it was a waste of bleach, so I'm just gonna roll with it. This may be the wrong decision. My intention is to marble the paper anyways. I'm hoping that it doesn't affect the color of the paints too much in the long run. Started off by filling the tub with water. I definitely should have used a larger bucket for this, but instead I made about a dozen trips getting enough water to submerge the decal. Ensure the decal is submerged with the screen facing up and the mold held firmly on top. I mixed in extra water with the pulp and gave it a good stir before pouring it over, trying to hold the mold firmly with the decal so only a little pulp escaped between the sides. I tried to set the decal somewhat over top of the tub because it did tend to drip quite a bit of water while I was absorbing the excess with a sponge. Once the paper was flipped over onto my table, I used an air compressor to remove it from the decal. I'm sure a blow dryer might have also worked for this, but it was well after 1 in the morning while filming this, and I quite enjoyed my neighbors not hating me. After so carefully flipping the paper over onto some paper towel, I found using an iron helped bond the fibers together. I did not notice the heat from the iron affecting the piece of mesh screen at all. I ended up storing the sheets on top of each other for drying. After the paper was made, I stored them under some heavy boxes until they were almost completely dried. It has been many days later, and it is finally time to see if this worked. Starting by moving the paper out from underneath these boxes up to the table, hopefully nothing gets damaged in this process and everything stays in paper form. Once they're on the table, I can start peeling back the paper towel and giving them a once-over with iron. Well, that was a lot of work for 11 sheets of paper. I believe the range of colors due to them being in different stages of the drying process. You can definitely still see the letters in the surface of the paper. It could have been blended for longer, but I honestly don't mind the way it looks. Before I could start marbling, there was some prep work that I needed to get done. This included making a alum solution to coat the paper with. This solution helps the paper pick up the paint from the surface of the sides. Following the ratio of 1 teaspoon of alum to 1 cup of water, I mixed the alum with some boiling water before topping it off with just some room temperature water and mixing thoroughly, ensuring to allow that time to completely cool off before transferring it over to the spray bottle. Moving on to marking the paper with an X before flipping it over and spraying it with the solution. I tried to completely saturate the surface of the paper without damaging the integrity of it. There are a couple ways to do this. I chose the misting method because it seemed the most delicate. I knew I wanted to hang up the paper to dry, so I took some clothespins, command strips, and some old string and strung up a line across my room. This will come in handy down the road when I want to hang my print. There are a couple things that worry me about the paper, firstly being its integrity. It does seem stronger since spraying it with the alum solution, but it is still quite brittle. I'm worried about how it will hold up against the marbling and washing process. There's definitely a lot of texture on the surface of the paper, and it is by no means perfectly flat. This concerns me because it will promote air bubbles getting trapped between the paper and the sides when I'm going to capture my print. When it comes to capturing my print, I am worried that the paper won't pick up the paint off the surface of the water, even though I did treat it with the alum solution. Next thing was to figure out how much size I needed. I took some water and poured it into my tub. It worked out I needed about a full gallon to fill the tub to about an inch. Not all carrageenan is created equally. Carrageenan is a seaweed-based agent that is used to replace gelatin. I chose to go with the capper variety because of its price and availability to me. There are some really great videos on YouTube that go more in depth about the different types of carrageenan and some of its substitutes. For the ratio that I used, I mixed 1/4 of a cup of carrageenan to 1 gallon of water. There are definitely different opinions about what this ratio should be. I ended up going with the manufacturer's recommendations that I found online. The size is a crucial part to the marbling process because it is what allows the paints to be suspended on the surface. My fear is my ratio of carrageenan to water or the general viscosity of the size is going to be wrong. The paint I will be using is acrylic ink. Generally, it's recommended to use drawing ink or acrylic paint mixed with water, but I find acrylic ink is easier to mix in small batches. Hopefully, it's still able to be suspended on the surface of the sides. Taking that all into consideration, my expectations are not high. I have my tub here that contains my size. The carrageenan seemed to be quite thick when I took it out of the fridge. Looked like quite a bit had evaporated overnight, so I just added back in the water to replace it and thin it down a little bit. I placed this lid here to help me transfer the paper from the sides over to my sink for washing. Down on the bottom, I have my paper as well as some tools that I'm going to be using. These guys are made out of a broom head that I purchased online and soon found out my cat desperately adored it. I basically just deconstructed the broom and added some elastic bands to hold it together. Another common tool is a comb or a rake. It's definitely not as nice as the ones people make out of wood. I just used foam board and some toothpicks. That's okay. I think it will still serve its purpose fine. I'm going to start by clearing the sides with some strips of paper towel just to remove any debris from the surface, and then I'm going to do a couple test drops of my inks into the sides and see how they spread, adjusting my water levels accordingly. Well, I think this might have worked. The paper did hold up fairly well. I think that the texture actually lent favor because I didn't have any problems capturing the print or with air bubbles forming in between the surface of the size and the paper. Don't get me wrong, there were definitely some casualties of war, including this piece that my cat so kindly stepped on while it was too wet to hang up. Even though I do have enough sheets to move on to the next step, I'm just really not that crazy about the colors, and a lot of the sheets could have definitely been thicker. So basically this means I did this entire process again. This time around I did make the paper thicker by using more pulp. This allowed me to coat the paper better with the alum solution, in turn making the colors more vibrant. Instead of mixing water into the acrylic ink, I added water to the size, almost doubling its volume and leaving the ink unmixed. I always started with a smaller sample of the size to test the consistency and the color combinations of the inks together before moving on and recreating it on a larger scale. I wasn't crazy about the results I was getting by using the rake. What I found worked best for me was dropping each color in individually and then using a single toothpick to move it around. I unfortunately did not figure this out until almost the last sheet of paper, so that meant I had to do this all again. This batch I definitely changed up the color as well as ran out of white acrylic ink. Luckily I did have white drawing ink on me, but I found it didn't float as nicely on the surface of the size, and the colors seem slightly muted when mixed with the white drawing ink. Unfortunately, I do have to draw the line somewhere, so I will be using these sheets for the next step when I go to bind them into the book. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, so I will be referencing a video by Darkchild57. They have a really great video that goes into the specifics and the steps of binding a book. Essentially, I will be creating some stacks of paper or signatures and sewing them into some leather. The leather I ended up going with was from Longsdale Leather, where I was able to go in and feel the different types of leather and find some scraps in one of their bins that was going to work for this project. Quite thick and sturdy, but still very soft and pliable to the touch. For the paper of the sketchbook, I will be using a student grade watercolor paper mixed in with the paper that I made. Other tools include a bone folder and pick. I grabbed a variety pack off Amazon that also included different colors of wax thread and needles. You can find all of these items individually at your leather supply store. The first step is going to be cutting the paper down to size and forming it into the signatures. Once it's in the signatures, I will move on to binding it into the leather. I now have 5 different signatures, including 3 that are wrapped with the paper that I made. Each signature is made up of 3 sketchbook pages folded in half. The paper I made is going to be additional on top of that. Due to the nature of the watercolor paper, it was quite thick, meaning I couldn't stack more than 3 pages into each signature. I do worry about the holes I punched into each signature. Even though I used a template, I felt like it was easily misaligned, and I worry down the road when I go to sew it in, it's going to not match up. My next step is going to be measuring and cutting my leather. I am going to try to distress it slightly by bending and folding it before sewing in the signatures. Again, if you really want to recreate this, I do recommend watching Darkchild57's video. They go into much better detail than I could about the actual process of the sewing. Since this is the first time I'm attempting this, I'm sure I'm gonna mess it up, so I recommend watching their video. As much as I psyched myself up for the binding process, it was actually relatively easy. I do recommend making a template when it comes to punching holes in the cover. This just makes it super simple and ensures that all the holes you punch end up being in the right spot. I did add a couple details to the outside of the sketchbook, including the friend that it's meant for's initials in the bottom corner and the small latch and buckle to hold it together. For both of these, I just ended up using a simple X stitch. The artist this sketchbook is intended for does a lot of leather work in their own time, so I wanted to leave the cover fairly blank. This will allow them to customize it, distress it, really do whatever they see fit. To finish this present off, I ordered a vintage Canadian Boy Scout first aid kit off a local shop on Etsy. I then took some half-pan watercolor trays and glued them inside the first aid kit using some E6000 glue. This is intended to be thrown into a backpack and taken with the sketchbook on hiking and camping trips, acting as a to-go palette. All in all, I am pretty happy with how this project turned out. There are a couple things that I will be doing differently next time, including sewing the signatures just a little closer together. I think this will give the book just a lot more structure. The whole process was very therapeutic, and I really enjoyed leather binding and the marbling. Both are definitely things that I'm going to explore further. As always, thank you for making it to the end of this video, and hopefully you enjoyed watching.